This video is sponsored by Readly, of whom more in a bit. When you think of the grand stations of London, you probably don't think of Ludgate Hill. In fact, there's a good chance that you've never even heard of Ludgate Hill. It hasn't existed for nearly a century, but it was about here. All that survives of the original is this sign at the late Sir William McAlpine's estate. Ludgate Hill was an ornate brick building, but it was built on a foundation of greed, recklessness, and impatience. It was the brainchild of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, who desperately wanted a terminus in the City of London. Their rivals, the South Eastern Railway, had London Bridge and were planning another station at Cannon Street. In 1860, the Metropolitan Extension Act gave the London, Chatham and Dover the authority they needed. They planned to build a new line up from Beckenham Junction to Battersea. At Herne Hill there would be a branch off into the city. Then it would dive into a tunnel under Snow Hill and would connect with the Metropolitan Railway, itself in the early stages of construction. The Metropolitan was intended to connect to other railway companies on the northern edge of the city, so the Chatham Lads plan would result in a key rail route across London, connecting railways in the north of the city with those in the south. It was a plan that couldn't possibly fail. Speed was of the essence. The LCDR borrowed enormous amounts of money with not even the slightest inkling of caution. After all, once this thing was finished, they could pay it all back, right? It would be a license to print money, right? They got to the south bank of the Thames in 1864 and built the first Blackfriars Station, which was here. The hope had been to head straight across the river, but the city corporation held things up. Mostly because the railway needed their go-ahead to build the bridge and the corporation couldn't decide what sort of bridge they should have. So the bridge that should have been waiting for the trains when they arrived was still under construction. For 6 months the railway waited, with trains terminating at Blackfriars until permission was received. In December 1864 the first trains crossed the river. Again, the hope was that there would be a station to receive them, but the roof had collapsed during construction and everything was behind schedule. The LCDR weren't going to wait, and so they opened another temporary terminus. This was accessed via Little Earl Street, which doesn't exist anymore, but was where Queen Victoria Street is now. In a rush, a new roof was thrown together out of rough-cut timber, and the still unfinished station opened on the 1st of June 1865. They didn't even await approval from the Board of Trade. Now, if your train has been delayed by 6 months, you could use this video's sponsor, Readly. Readly is a magazine reading app that you can use on your tablet, your laptop, your phone, or any other device you might happen to have upon your person while standing in an unfinished station. It gives you access to literally thousands of newspapers and magazines on all sorts of subjects and in many different languages. And that's before we've got onto the back issues. It has back issues. I haven't bought a single paper magazine since I got Readly. And as a train nerd, I read a lot of magazines. Readly just makes things easier. No more flicking through the titles in the newsagent, desperately hoping they have something vaguely interesting. No more lugging around enough glossy magazines to keep you going on a long journey. No more wasting money on an entire magazine that only had 1 or 2 articles worth reading. No more looking like some kind of weird hoarder with a room full of magazines because you found something really useful. Like, say, an article on Thameslink Class 700s. For a single, inexpensive monthly subscription, you get enough reading matter to keep you busy for, well, probably the rest of your life. Titles are downloadable for reading offline, and you can share your account with up to 5 other people, which will at least temporarily spare you from their complaints about you bringing them to a station that wasn't opened yet. If all that sounds good to you, and it sure does to me, there's an exclusive offer for viewers of this channel. Follow the link in the description below and you can get 2 months absolutely free. If for any reason you're not happy with Readly, you can cancel at any time, with no strings attached. The only drawback I can think of is the possibility that you'll get so distracted by your magazine on the train that you miss your stop. I take no responsibility for that. So why were the LCDR in such an all-fired hurry? Well, borrowing a lot of money seemed like a great idea at the time, but the creditors were starting to look menacing. Constructing a railway through South London had taken all the money they had and, so to speak, all the money they didn't have. The fact that the station was obviously unfinished was noted by the press at the time, who also somewhat sniffily noted that it was far from the grandest of stations. That was true, but the LCDR were at something of a disadvantage. Stations like Paddington and King's Cross were built in areas that were, relatively speaking, fairly undeveloped. There was room to flex. Ludgate Hill, meanwhile, was built in one of the most densely packed urban centres in Britain. Even in this rather poor area, land was expensive. Many houses had had to be demolished, and that came with a proviso. The company had to provide cheap fares for workers in order to compensate for the fact that they'd had to move out. The fares were valid on the 6:15 p.m. train in the evening, and at the frankly horrifying hour of 4:55 in the morning. As a result of the restrictions, the station was far smaller than it would ideally have been. There were 2 island platforms accessed via a narrow bridge from the booking hall. The line itself was built on a viaduct which, controversially, obscured the view up Ludgate Hill towards St. Paul's Cathedral. The whole thing was rather cramped, especially when you consider that it had to cater both for city commuters from the suburbs and continental passengers en route to Dover. In July 1865, the LCDR replied to the Board of Trade saying that the station was finally finished. One Colonel Yolland inspected it and informed them that, no, it wasn't. It was insufficiently spacious and probably unsafe. Also, what's the big idea of opening without Board of Trade approval? It took 2 more assurances from company engineers that everything was ready, and 2 more inspections for approval to finally be granted in January of 1866. In the early days, Ludgate Hill was purely a terminus, but in the same month that Board of Trade approval was granted, the link to the Metropolitan Railway was completed. This was largely due to the man in charge. If you'd been a little bit silly with your railway and now a bunch of angry men were demanding money with menaces, there was only one guy to call: James Stats Forbes. Forbes was the general manager of the London Chatham and Dover Railway. He'd been brought in because he was an excellent troubleshooter and a born diplomat. He brought the Great Northern Railway and the London and South Western Railway to the negotiating table. The Great Northern Railway was north of the city, they were the ones who owned King's Cross, and the London and South Western was to the south, they were the ones who had Waterloo. It was an easy matter to persuade both of them that they could make bank off Ludgate Hill and the line across the city. So both companies contributed over £300,000 apiece to get access to this new route. Still, financial difficulties aside, the gamble of building Ludgate Hill looked at first like it was going to pay off. As well as the London Chatham and Dover, the Great Northern and the London and South Western, the Midland Railway negotiated access. Even the South Eastern Railway were allowed in, although only to set passengers down. In turn, the LCDR had the right to run trains over the other companies' lines, which greatly improved their reach. Ludgate Hill was also one of the best located stations in the city. I mean, it was literally just down the road from St. Paul's Cathedral. You can't get much more City of London than that. But it soon became a victim of its own success. Per Colonel Yolland's warnings, the station was too small to cope with the number of passengers using it. So, not long after the opening of Ludgate Hill, the LCDR were applying for permission to build another station just a short distance up the road at Holborn Viaduct. This opened in 1874. That same year, a smaller station, known as Snow Hill, was opened basically next to Holborn Viaduct Station, in the tunnel. These took some pressure off Ludgate Hill, but not enough. So in 1886, the LCDR opened yet another station, this time on the other side of Ludgate Hill. This station would be called St. Paul's, but you would know it as Blackfriars. So to be clear, the impoverished LCDR had built Ludgate Hill, which they could barely afford, but because they'd cheaped out on it, they now had 4 expensive city stations. I also think it's curious that the new station was called St. Paul's when Ludgate Hill was closer to St. Paul's. There's just no logic at play here. It will come as no surprise to learn that by 1899 the LCDR was absolutely broke. The good work of James Stats Forbes had largely been undone by a financial crisis in 1866, and since then they'd been barely hanging on. So they formed an unlikely alliance with the South Eastern Railway, which was in the same boat. The two companies joined forces as the South Eastern and Chatham Railway. Now, I'm not going to say that their problems were solved, but at least they wouldn't be messing around trying to outdo one another all the time. As the 20th century dawned, it was clear that something needed to be done about Ludgate Hill. Frankly, the logical thing would have been to close it. The company had 4 stations in quick succession, just minutes apart on foot. The original Blackfriars station had closed to passengers in 1884, and that had had a far better case for necessity than Ludgate Hill. But despite all that, there were plenty of passengers who still liked Ludgate Hill. For the location, if nothing else. So what to do? Well, they couldn't make it any bigger, really, but they could at least make better use of the space they had. One of the platforms would be demolished, the idea being that all express trains would now go to Holborn Viaduct, and all commuter trains would terminate here. The remaining platform would be lengthened and widened. The roof, which was still the rough wooden one from 1865, would be replaced with a proper iron canopy. The overall height of the station would be reduced. The entrances and exits would be widened. The tracks would be rearranged. The bridges would be strengthened with steel girders. Works were carried out between 1908 and 1912. Rather slow compared with the tearing hurry of the 1860s, but the company were anxious to avoid disrupting the busy commuter services. In fact, they managed to complete the work with minimal disturbance. But it was all starting to look rather futile. Electric tube trains and trams had come along in the 1900s, and these were both affordable and modern compared to the steam locomotives and wooden coaches of the South Eastern and Chatham. Passengers began to desert Ludgate Hill. The First World War made things worse. From 1916, the Snow Hill Tunnel was closed to passenger trains in order to make way for military traffic over this strategically important line. The service was never revived. London and South Western Railway trains went the same year. Great Northern and Midland trains had gone in 1907 and 1908 respectively. Soon the station was deserted outside of rush hour. In 1919, less than a decade after the railway unveiled their new station for the future of commuting, it was only open during peak hours. In 1923, the South Eastern and Chatham Railway was amalgamated into the Southern Railway. The new owners began a massive program of electrification to enable them to compete directly with the tubes and trams. In theory, this should have made Ludgate Hill competitive again, but ironically it would do the opposite. Even after rebuilding, the platform was too short to take the new electric trains. And so, on the 2nd of March 1929, the station would close completely. The facade would be hidden behind shops, and trains to Holborn Viaduct would rush straight past the ghostly abandoned platforms. The canopy would go in the 60s and the platform in the 70s. In the 80s, the London, Chatham and Dover Railway's dream of cross-London trains would be revived, in the form of the Thameslink scheme. By this time, the tunnel under Snow Hill was disused and Holborn Viaduct was holding on by its fingernails. The Thameslink project involved, among other things, closing Holborn Viaduct and reopening the Snow Hill Tunnel. But this wasn't going to be a cheap, cramped line built in a hurry. This would be a modern main line. Unfortunately for railway historians, but fortunately for views of the cathedral, this meant that the viaduct through Ludgate Hill would have to go. The old approach to Snow Hill Tunnel had been fiercely steep. Thameslink would have a much gentler descent from Blackfriars. Demolition work took place in 1990, and for the first time in over 60 years, the old station facade was revealed. And then it was knocked down, so the Thameslink gradient could plough through the site. The sign above the entrance was retained. The story goes that McAlpine's foreman had standing instructions whenever they did a demolition job on the railway to call the boss and ask if he wanted them to keep anything. These days, City Thameslink effectively replaces both Ludgate Hill and Holborn Viaduct. At Ludgate Hill, there's basically nothing to indicate that a station was even there. It seems sort of appropriate. Ludgate Hill was, frankly, never a good station. It was built quickly, inadequate from the start, and unable to adapt. It makes a sort of sense that it would be swept away so easily. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like, and you may wish to subscribe for more. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the rough wooden pillars to my cheaply constructed roof. I would also like to thank Readly for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their offer. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.